prophecy, insanity, porters, messages and speeches, and stickomythic dialogue. I mean, blew my mind.
Yeah, it's a Greek world, man. Like
I went to
Shakespeare's just living
class
in it.
the next day that we were talking in our East Class class, and I said, "Has anybody seen Macbeth yet?" And they all just jumped out of their seats, saying, "The parallels are so amazing! What they?" And so confirmation, and then I just went to work on it.
Welcome, everyone. I am so delighted to have a close friend, mentor, an amazing scholar, Earl Showerman, with us today. Earl is going to be talking about his exciting new book, which I've been loving, Shakespeare's Greater Greek, which looks fantastic. Kudos to Lucinda. Earl Showerman is a Harvard college graduate, University of Michigan Medical School, emergency room physician of note, also the former president of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, and I think just kind of one of our favorite resources for talking about how Edward de Vere and Shakespeare were so influenced by Greek sources, which I think has been slept on a bit by the mainstream scholarly establishment, and perhaps intentionally so. So, Earl, do you want to just talk to me about how you got into, I mean, maybe briefly touch on the Shakespeare authorship question generally, but also more specifically how you got into the Greek flavor of it?
Well, thank you, Phoebe, for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about how this book developed over a 20-year period of in my retirement. When I left the emergency medicine, the next day I was enrolled taking Shakespeare classes at the Southern Oregon University. So I was on fire right then at the beginning, and I had been inspired by, of course, the mysterious William Shakespeare, Jonathan Ogburn Jr.'s book, which was eye-opening, that I knew about back in the mid 80s when it was first published, but really hadn't gotten involved in it much until I heard about a conference in Portland at Concordia University, sponsored by Dan Wright, who was the director of what was called the De Vere Studies program then, but later became the Shakespeare Authorship Studies Center. And for the next 14, 15 years, I would go annually to that conference and suck up and absorb so much of what was inspirational about the whole authorship question, and from some of the great scholars and people who would produce books in the years ahead. And so it was really being at the cutting edge of something, just jumping at the deep end right away by the association of going up to Concordia. And then I began buying books and getting more interested in it. And I was very fortunate in that first year of studying Shakespeare in my retirement. Liz Eckhart was my instructor in Shakespeare studies, and we studied Hamlet. And it came out to her that I was an Oxfordian because I was able to explain something about where the pirates came from in the story and why the word naked was being used there. And so I had to confess that I was an Oxfordian, and she said, fantastic. So
Wow.
I was blessed by an instructor who was open to my initial impulse to study the question of Hamlet and whether it might have been inspired by a very similar Greek ancient story, the most famous of all trilogies, the only trilogy we have, which is the Oresteia of Aeschylus, which is where the son returns home after the father's been murdered by the mother colluding with the lover, and then murders them in revenge. And, so the parallels in plot were stunning to me. And under Liz's guidance and with the library at the university, which had 7,000 Shakespeare titles at that time. They probably have 10,000 titles now in this Marjorie Bailey collection. She was a professor at Stanford, and her students were part of the acting company that came up to Ashland when the Oregon Shakespeare Festival was founded back in the 1930s. So she got involved, was a dramaturg and all that. When she passed, she gave all her books to the theater, which was the Renaissance Institute, and eventually they all ended up at the university. And they had a fabulous collection of books there. So when I went in, and this is like another pure serendipity, I entered into two search fields, Orestes, Hamlet. Hit enter, my life changed because up popped Gilbert Murray's 1914 50-page discourse on the similarities of the Orestes dramas, not only of Aeschylus, but also of Euripides and Sophocles and Shakespeare's Hamlet. He had no meat. This was published in 1914 and pretty much ignored by every scholar commenting on Hamlet ever since then. Only two or three have had made any reference to his fabulous work. And Gilbert Murray was the leading translator of Euripides in England at that time in the first half of the 20th century. He was a humanist. He was a larger than life character. He served in the League of Nations, the United Nations. He was a co-founder of Oxfam. he was a huge man, had a big head, a big idea, and he said, I don't know how it happens. You must suppose some archetypal transmission of tragic types to account for the similarities here, but it really makes me think he was familiar with the Orestes dramas of all the Greek tragedians. So, wow, that made my first experience of writing a paper about this a cakewalk because I had his book. And then William Tybalt, a Baconian, published a book in 1908, so a few years earlier. And he outlined all the classical sources that he could identify in all the plays of Shakespeare. He was a Victorian diplomat, but he was also an independent scholar, like many of us. And he had a fascination with Shakespeare and the classics. And so he just outlined that. So his book was on the shelf. Gilbert Murray's book was on the shelf. These 100-year-old editions were in my hands. And it completely transformed my life and made me something of a very motivated person because I was hot on the trail of something. The initial findings had been laid out for me a century earlier, and I knew that scholars had basically ignored this issue because of a talk I heard from Andrew Worth, an undergraduate at the Concordia Conference. I believe it was 2002, so it was over 20 years ago. Andrew was a very talented, very bright young man, junior that year. But I'm sure under the guidance of Stephanie Hughes and Jan Wright, he found a golden thread of denialism around Shakespeare's use of Greek sources. He found all the 20th century scholars who were saying, no, 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 he couldn't have understood Greek at all. It wasn't available, wasn't published in England. He never referenced any Greek plays whatsoever. And they made that statement over and over again, and it continues on into the early 20th century, the same denial of anything that related to that. And he knew, because he was reading earlier texts by Churton Collins and a few others, that there was a major Greek influence in a lot of things, including sonnets 153 and 154, which reflect themes and images from the Greek anthology, which was an unpublished, untranslated Greek source that somehow the author of those last two sonnets got his hands on and used as source for that. So that was actually his finding and reference and development of that whole theme around Shakespeare's Greek was quoted by Stanley Wells at a European Shakespeare conference, and he said dismissively, and of course he's an Oxfordian, so, but he does make a good point that the Greek anthology is likely to be there. So he talked about in the Oxfordian issue that came out later that year under Stephanie Hughes's editorship, and he pointed out how certain names, words, metaphors, dialogue conventions of the stage were reflective of Greek theater, and he quoted a number of the earlier scholars, and so he laid a seed in my brain that was ready to hatch out when I started school about a year later. Because I was interested in the Greeks from the get-go. I read the Greek epic when I was in university. I read the modern Greek poets in my 30s, Kazantzakis and the Greek poets, Kavafi, Sapphoros, others. So I loved everything from Zorba the Greek to The Last Temptation of Christ to the Odyssey, a modern sequel that took me a whole summer to read. So I was deeply invested in Greek myth, Greek mythology, Greek narratives. And then this came along and it opened the door to 2 decades of immersion in exploration of how this might help us understand Shakespeare and the creation of the whole Elizabethan realistic drama that derived its roots from that very early beginning, 2,000 years earlier. So it's just a remarkable story that had been ignored by scholars for a better part of a century.
Absolutely. Well, so, I have a little bit of a confession to make because I was having so much fun reading your book. And I read in your, acknowledgement section, or when you were kind of giving the forward, maybe, where you were saying how you'd taken some great works courses to kind of beef up on Greek drama and also Shakespeare. And I was like, if I'm going to have this conversation with Earl, I don't want to look like a fool. So I actually have been I'm kind of halfway through the Elizabeth Van
Oh,
Divers. I knew
yes.
it. I can tell because I'm reading it and I'm seeing like the
Yeah,
influence. And
she's
so I've been
great.
reading. I spent all week in the sea of joy, as you put it.
Oh,
I've read, and I'm like, it's so obvious. It's like the lightning. It's so obvious. Like I read, kind of following her curriculum. I started with Aeschylus and Agamemnon, and then the Oresteia, and it couldn't be more clear. Reading Electra by Sophocles, I was like, wait. this feels just like Hamlet sitting around and his uncle's on the throne and he's kind of feels impotent and frustrated. It felt exactly this. It felt just on a gut level, so obviously just with that same emotional tenor. And I think sometimes that's lost, like when we're debating Stratfordians or when people are doing the stylometrics or saying this line and this word connects to it. But just reading the gestalt feeling of the play, I was like, clearly Shakespeare has read this play. Like it just feels like so. This feels to me like I'm in the world of Hamlet. I also was reading Antigone, and then I came across the famous like Ode to Human Nature, Ode to Man speech, and I was like, wait, is this like what a piece of work is man? Like I just was like feeling all these connections, and it seemed so obvious that Greek drama was obviously at the root of what Edward de Vere was trying to do. So I wanted to ask you a little more. You talk in your book about, and I think we've discussed this, not only is Shakespeare influenced by having read these Greek sources, but it kind of goes further than that. I think you have a thesis that you push that is that, in fact, he was sort of revitalizing this tradition that full tragedy had kind of fallen out of favor or out of practice. And so you say that he was must have been really excited to kind of revive this tradition. So I'm wondering if you could talk about what that means specifically, like what before Edward de Vere, Elizabeth, or before the Elizabethan period, what drama in England looked like, and was it not full tragedy? And then how did the kind of influence of the Greek tragedy make it so much better and more complete?
Well, it was cruder. You had Gorboduc and a few other plays that were early in the 1550s, 60s, 70s. But you don't get into the really sophisticated stuff until the 1580s or so. John Lilly and some others, and Green and other playwrights are really ramping it up. And so, really, by 1590 or so, you're in full swing with a realistic drama that I think Shakespeare, the dating of Shakespeare's plays, of course, is quite controversial. I would recommend anybody who's interested in this to look up datingshakespearesplays.uk, and you'll get to the De Vere Society site that has all that information. But it's
Cool.
very controversial, the dating, and I'm certain that there was an early Hamlet in 1589. I'm certain that there was an early, many plays that were early. All's Well, I think, was dated probably to the early 1590s or late 1580s. So there are a lot of hinges on that dating scheme and the whole political allegorical context that Oxfordians and there are other authors, of course, who are likely to be involved in that kind of satiric representation of court figures, such as Lord Burleigh, as Polonius, of course, and then, of course, in Midsummer Night's Dream, Titania represents Queen Elizabeth, and the Duke d'Alençon is picked up by Bottom. I mean, the evidence for that has been cultivated and written up by scholars for a long, long time, going back to Eva Turner Clarke and Percy Allen. They wrote about the fact that Midsummer Night's Dream is an obvious comic political allegory. And then one day, Rick Wagaman, our eminent colleague, sent me an article that suggested that the bird song that Bottom sings is similar to a bird song in Aristophanes' The Birds.
Wow.
And of course, Aristophanes wrote political satire. The Birds and the other plays he wrote satirized those corrupt elements of Greek society in the golden era. I mean, he mocks Socrates in the clouds. He mocks the leaders, Cleon and others and all that. So maybe this is based on an Aristophanic model. And so I went into that and found out, okay, there's transformation in both of them. Men in the birds gain wings, whereas Bottom gains an ass's head. So there's transformation, but the similarities and the political allegory point out that there was a subtle connection there. So I think it was revolutionary, and it was so subtle because without being well educated in the classics and even knowing the Greek drama, you wouldn't appreciate some of the plays. And I think I've written about the bulk of them that seem to be most strongly influenced by Greek literature, whether it's the histories, the epic, or in fact the dramas, which were untranslated in England. There was a Latin translation of Antigone by Thomas Watson. There was other translations of individuals or adaptations of one or two of other Euripides plays, Iphigenia, Aeschylus, and I think Hecuba, but the rest of the plays didn't exist in England, were never published there. There were Latin translations published in continental print houses in Paris and Venice and all throughout Europe, Latin translations, some vernacular translations, but none in England, which poses such a challenge and problem, which is why I think it's been ignored for 100 years until a few serious scholars have gotten on the case, and include my hero, Tanya Pollard, who was a Yale graduate, Rhodes Scholar, came back, got her PhD at Yale, and now is a professor at Brooklyn College. Her book, Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages, deeply explores this whole issue of the Greek influence on Shakespeare in the tragic female characters and even some of the comic female characters he represents. And her study is impeccable and definitely confirms that. And yet, she doesn't go so far as to suggest Sophocles or Aeschylus may have influenced Shakespeare, any
Wow.
other discourse on it. She focuses on Euripides primarily, and that he would have been more popular. More editions were available. Earlier translation, there was no translation of Aeschylus to English until I think the 18th century.
I really liked a line that you quote when you're talking about the kind of scholarly sort of like blinders that are ignoring the Greek influence. And I guess the scholar A.D. Nuttall says, we have to admit this, we have to accept this bleak truth that Shakespeare never read Greek drama. And I don't know, that phrase bleak truth, it really stuck out to me because it is depressing. It's like, it's so enriching reading all these wonderful anecdotes that you've kind of connected that other scholars have dug out. It's almost as fun, it's just the way that it's so much richer reading Troilus and Cressida or, Midsummer Night's Dream with the Oxfordian angle, knowing where the naked pirates in Hamlet, anecdote comes from. Like the way that Oxfordianism is so enriching. It's like without the Greek element, it's so bleak. Like, so I feel like it infuses it with so much more joy seeing, being able to connect these dots and knowing what the real context and references are. Um,
The beautiful irony, Phoebe, since you mentioned Timon, is that A.D. Nuttall's edition of Twain's Timon edition, he makes a highly convincing case that Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus has numerous parallels to Timon of Athens.
mm.
And I was shocked to see how much he recognized among the Greek elements of that play that influenced Shakespeare's structure, his the way he tells a story, the dramaturgy of the two daughters coming and the two prostitutes that come with Alcibiades versus Theseus and the daughters, and the parallels in image and plot and rhetoric seem to really underline a Greek-inspired edition, and so it really got me off. I'm looking for more elements that would reflect Greek drama in Timon. And after I heard Charles Beauclerc's wonderful talk on Timon of Athens, and made it so personal, when I recognized and understood that it was an early play dated to 1584, when we have the first reference to the Athenian misanthropos biting on the stage in a published book that also references a John Lyly play, Campaspe, and Troilus and Cressida, because there's a reference to the coy prophetess in her cell, which would have been Cassandra.
Mm.
So three literary references in 1584. One of them is the Athenian myth. Well, you look at Oxford's life in the early 1580s. He's in shambles. He's selling off every estate he owned. He's bereft of finance. It takes 2 more years before he gets his annuity from the court. And so he's kind of at the bottom of things. And I think there are certain elements of that, including what you reference is the bowl and ewer, which one of the characters dreams Timon's going to give him, which in fact is the sacramental instruments of the Lord Great Chamberlain, the office that the Earl of Oxford holds. So there's personal stuff in there that connects him to the play, and also Timon writes the fantasy of the Mask of the Amazons. He says, "I wrote that myself." So he acknowledges that he himself is a playwright, a musician, and rather proud of it at the same time. He's overspending and losing everything. But the bitterness of it is hard to swallow for modern audiences. But I think if you see it as just a profound satire, an overreach on the degradation that Timon is suffering, and the tragic gravitas he doesn't really have. It bespeaks something that was written early and in an emotional state of some financial despair.
Yeah. My name, Phoebe, is a Greek name that also shows up in Shakespeare. Are there any other Greek names that end up in Shakespeare?
Oh, well, Laertes, of course, and the Greek dramas are filled with Greek names like Midsummer Night's Dream. And what he does, he's so clever. He uses the characters from Plutarch. Oxford bought his French edition of Plutarch when he was 19 years old, along with the Geneva Bible and Plato and Chaucer. He was a collector at 19. He loved the narratives of Plutarch, and it was, over 1,000 pages before you get to the death of Cleopatra. So he was, if this was the way that he got his inspiration for theatrical representation, among other things, including Plato's Symposium, where Socrates tells Aristophanes and Agathon, the tragedian who won the competition that year, that the great playwrights write both comedies and tragedy. So he may be inspired by
Wow.
that. But he uses Plutarch's characters, the historical characters, to characterize his fictional characters, like Demetrius and Lysander, were both heroes that represented the Spartans and the people that restored order to Athens at the end of war times. So they were both heroes along with Theseus for Athens. So you don't even, he names these young men. You have no idea why they're named that, but they're named for Greek heroes, And Antigonus, who is, in the Winter's Tale and is ordered to transport the child away to, die in Bohemia. He's named after Antigonus the First, who was, the successor to Alexander the Great. And when his wife Paulina says, "Well, Alexander didn't choose who would follow him. The most noble took his place." She's complimenting the man that her husband is named after, among other things. So these subtleties within it that he weaves in, and he uses Plutarch's nomenclature in all the plays, including certainly Titus Andronicus and, a number of the romances. They're all filled with those kinds of characters that are named for historical characters. So he gives character ideas to people who are referenced in Plutarch, and he gives them the same kind of personalities.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like the entire Thomas North authorship theory, which we've kind of been hearing more about, I guess, lately. Like, it basically is based off of how much Shakespeare draws from Plutarch. So I hope that some people in the North camp might check out your book and get to see a little bit of a broader context. So I'm interested in like the perspective of Greek, like the worldview that is espoused in Greek tragedy. I'm curious. This is like a cluster of things. I'm curious about you really got into this Greek stuff, and it clearly lit you up. And so I'm interested in what the connection is between you and it, and also just the difference or the similarities between that Greek. Yeah, what is Greek tragedy and how, like, what are its aims civically? What are the messages within the medium of Greek tragedy? And how does it compare and contrast to Elizabethan drama?
Well, they were inventing it as it went along, I mean, when Aeschylus started, there were only two actors, and then Sophocles adds a third actor, and then Euripides throws the whole stage wide open by the time he gets to it. They start with a lot of choruses, and they end up with very minimal chorus and much more realistic drama. Euripides, of course, we have many more of his plays than we have either Aeschylus or Sophocles. I think 18 and versus 7 of the other two playwrights each. So we have a handful of Aristophanes plays also, but that's it. We have 1/100th of what was produced during that classical age because of the competitions that the culture had. Now, these are religious ceremonies. Certainly the tragedies were. The comedies may have not been quite so, religious so much as body, because they were really body. I mean, Aristophanes has of stage directions that when these characters get frightened, they shit their pants. They had some kind of prop, and the birds chorus had these giant curved phalanxes extending from them through the whole thing. So they were bold and out there in the comedies. The tragedies you had to take much more seriously, and there were the trilogies that were a series of 3 or 4 days in which you would go and see a trilogy and another trilogy and another trilogy. These were competitions that had sponsors. These are religious festivities. It was the hugest thing. I mean, and the audiences were, in the 20 to 30,000, 40,000 people came there. All the males came. I don't know that their women were ever allowed. It doesn't seem so. They weren't citizens. So these were exclusively for citizens. A few barbarians would be invited too. So it was an incredible cultural evolutionary change that was going on in so many spheres, in the sphere of philosophy, in the spheres of history, of architecture, of painting, of vases, of sculptures. The genius of the Greek explosion in the wake of their triumph over the Persians, first at Marathon, where the Athenians kicked butt on Darius's invasion, and then in a much bigger confrontation at Plataea, at the battle there, and where the Spartans beat them, and then the Battle of Salamis, where the Athenian navy sunk the Persian navy, a million-man army that went down. I mean, the inflation, the
Wow.
sense of identity and power, empowerment, and blessings by the gods during this ferment was this an amazing thing. If you read the Greek history of that time and dabble into what was being written and who these characters really were, it's like, oh, the ferment of it, the enthusiasm and the changing culture of it. And regrettably, they went too far. Pericles, for all his honorable intentions and the funeral orations and all that, he brought down the wrath of Sparta on Athens. And there was the war, the Peloponnesian War, he kind of triggered it in some ways and was considered a warmonger. And yet you end up with a 30-year war with a superior power that deflates your entire national or city-state identity and power. And you end up in the hands of the Spartans 30 years on down the line and at the mercy of Lysander, another character from Shakespeare, who saves the Athenians by saying, we don't kill all the men and sell all the women and children to slavery. You beat the Persians. We will honor you. Simply, we'll change governments, and then you guys will get back to whatever you do best. And that was the way the Peloponnesian War, after all its destructiveness, ended. And Lysander was the man that saved the Athenians from being totally annihilated and Athens being a rubble. So these are huge characters that Shakespeare puts in his plays, and they're very interesting. And so you see the weaving of the historical context in with the artistic creative context, and it's a never-ending story of educating yourself because it goes deep, and you could get lost in it. So that's where I've been for the better part of 20 years, kid.
Wow. So many thoughts. First of all, wow, I'm glad I asked that question because you're right. It is very different having all the phalluses and it's hard to imagine because people will say, oh, Shakespeare is actually really naughty. But it's like, if you compare it, like it's pretty buttoned up compared to what they were getting up to in ancient Greece vis-a-vis, yeah, like anatomy. Like that's an interesting cultural difference for sure. I loved how you said in the past and about the comparison between the victory between the Athenians and their victory over a larger imperial kind of state and how that made them confident, and comparing that to Elizabeth's victory over the
Right.
Spaniards. And so
God.
that kind of equivalent optimism that I guess creates motivation to kind of continue to build these art forms and to bring them out into the world.
The
The
pressure, the
pressure.
cultural pressures were intense for survival, and then the victory brought you something new. And now, of course, there was more than one armada that came from Spain, and the war went on for almost 20 years. But after the defeat of the first round, the inflated spirit of it, and of course, Shakespeare.
What about hubris? Is because I'm like when you're talking about the Peloponnesian War and Pericles, and that seems like
uh,
hubris is the fatal flaw. Do you think Shakespeare has the same sense of Shakespeare's more about the fault being in our stars, right? Like, I mean, hubris is obviously a major theme in Shakespeare, but I guess if there was a fatal flaw that the Elizabethan regime represented that kind of brought the, I mean, I just these are just scattered thoughts that I have. I'm just comparing kind of the ethos of Greek drama versus Elizabethan comedy or tragedy. I'm just curious, comparing the two.
Well, the evolution of the relationship between the divinities and humans in Greece, going back to Hesiod, the story of Asclepius, okay, the divine healer, the healer god. He could raise the dead. He was given the gift of Gorgon's blood from Athena, and he could bring back heroes who had perished in battle. Well, in the Hesiod story, and it's repeated in Pindar stories. It's repeated in Ovid stories. So the evolution of this whole situation with Asclepius comes down to this. In Hesiod, he's struck dead with a thunderbolt for the hubris of raising the dead. That he could depopulate the underworld if he continued to do this. That was the risk. It was his
Wow.
hubris to practice what the gods only had the power to do. So then in Pindar, 200 years later, so this is 5th century BC or 6th century, he writes the same story, but no, he struck dead because he demanded a bag of gold coins for raising the dead. So
Huh.
his ego, his greed, supplaced the arbitrariness of the god, so that it became more humanized as you came down the pike as to what was the explanation of it.
Humanized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the evolution of the myth goes on with this. And Ovid's Metamorphoses has several long chapters on how Asclepius was summoned by the Romans to bring him to the Tiber Island, and he goes on and on and on about Asclepius. And of course, Asclepius is a fascinating character in Shakespeare's because Lord Cerimon does represent the Asclepian tradition in its purest form from Pericles, and in the speech he gives about how he learned from his study of the books and his practice and his knowledge of minerals and how the plant life can contribute to life and all that. He gives this beautiful speech and he says, and no, I don't want to acquire wealth. These things can be frittered away by, ancestors. I mean, your descendants who pay no attention to things. But I would tie my reputation up only, because of the respect I gain and the relationship I have with this sacred skill that I have. That's been a gift given to me. So it's very a beautiful statement, and it's Asclepian in its purest form. So I think the Earl of Oxford was very interested in medicine, and his wife, certainly Anne Cecil, was an acknowledged practicing medical practitioner. And it's about her story that I want to talk about at our conference in New Haven when we come up, because it's a really good story.
Oh, I'm so excited. What a great teaser for New Haven, which I hope
Yeah.
everyone's already planning to go to. This is just a random thing. Speaking of Asclepius, wasn't there, I read, I think this is in the Great Courses thing. So there was a giant snake, right? And didn't
Yeah.
Sophocles have to keep it in his house? And I was just picturing, as you were saying this, I was like, imagine Edward de Vere having to keep, like, he has his basin and his ewer, and those are his, like, duties as his Lord Chamberlain, and those are the tools of his trade. But Sophocles has to keep a giant snake in his house because of like ritual medicinal lore, right? So that's it. I mean that you.
That's a fabulous story. I'm unaware of. However, I will amplify the relationship between Asclepius and the serpent with Sophocles. Sophocles was chosen as the archon, the leader of Athens, to welcome the Asclepian cult when it moved to Athens in the 420s BC. He was chosen of all the Athenian nobles to be the one to welcome them. So his relationship with Asclepius and with the serpent of Asclepius, in an Ovid story of this, the god comes in the form of a serpent that leaves the temple of Epidaurus, gets on the ship in the harbor and goes all the way to Tiber Island and becomes the sacred spirit within the Asclepian healing temple there in Rome or near Rome. So it's quite wrapped up he's wrapped up in that story. Now, I want to tell you, Phoebe, about one experience that I've been given a lot of leads over the years to that led to papers, for the Winter's Tale that I wrote about in 2006. Merrilee Carr, a physician in Portland, sent me a review of a production of Alcestis at Reed College Classical Greek Theater that compared to Alcestis, and that put me on the trail. I gave the talk a year later at our conference in Ann Arbor, and Brian Bechtold, a Shakespeare professor up in Montana, said, that's like Much Ado. When you look into Much Ado, of course, the next year was eaten up looking into Much Ado, and that ended up with a very nice good paper that expanded on the references of Euripides' Alcestis as a source for the final scenes of Hero at her tomb, and then in the marriage to Hero, between Hero and Claudio. And then, I've gotten leads from other scholars within our community. Stephen Sable said, you really want to look at Titus Andronicus. And of course, Titus Andronicus is a painful story. I've not wanted to go to a production of it, but I should have. I haven't yet. Certainly, part of the story is based on Arthur Golding's translation of Trogus Pompeius, which he dedicated to the Earl of Oxford. So it's another fabulously rich connection that goes through what was originally Greek literature. Now, my experience personally with this mystery is this, and the serendipity has proven itself to be my blessing over and over again in this. The Oregon Shakespeare Festival in 2011, I believe, produced a classical version of Macbeth. Chilling, really chilling, and just the sense of evil was so powerful. And at the same time, I was taking a course in the Lifelong Institute, a 10-week course reading the Aeschylus Oresteia. And we read several different translations of that. And after seeing the play, having been reading it in depth, that trilogy, I was shocked and went home and I wrote up a list of things that I saw in the Aeschylus drama, and I got them in the book here. I wrote them down when I got home. I couldn't sleep until I made a list. The assassination of Duncan and Agamemnon is done off stage in the Greek manner, both of them. Okay. The display of bloody knives after the assassination occurs in both plays. There's a motif of blood-stained, unclean hands. That's also in Hamlet, that out damn spot that cannot be removed. There's the masculine queens capable of seductive equivocation, comparing Clytemnestra and Lady Macbeth, a very, very solid parallel in many ways. The theme of the poisoned breast that comes out in both plays, sleepless nights, dream terrors, night lights, and voices coming from the dark, from the unknown in the house, revenge-driven ghosts, fury-like chorus of the three weird sisters, which Shakespeare kept on stage in the side, watching the rest of the action. So they were there almost the entire play, just casting their web, prophecy, insanity, porters, message and speeches, and stickomythic dialogue. I mean, blew my mind.
Yeah, it's a Greek world, man. Like
I went to
Shakespeare's just living
class
in it.
the next day that we were talking in our Shakespeare in our East Class class, and I said, "Has anybody seen Macbeth yet?" And they all just jumped out of their seats, saying, "The parallels are so amazing! What they?" And so confirmation, and then I just went to work on it and realized that many people writing in the 19th century, and they most notably Lord Campbell, the Chancellor of England, the Lord Chancellor who wrote about Shakespeare's legal acquirement, he wrote compellingly comparing Aeschylus to Macbeth. In Macbeth, the spirit of them is just so common. Well, I spent the next few months exploring what I could find in the Hannen Library, and they had the Variorum editions, which are these 100-year-old, fabulously annotated editions, and found a number of scholars from the late 19th century that had some idea about the parallels between Macbeth and the Greek drama. And so just casting around, I found more and more and more good material. And I think fairly original comparison of those two dramas that came from the direct experience of theater with the knowledge of what I had gained in my class.
Wow. Well, your enthusiasm is infectious, and I so encourage people to pick up this masterpiece from one of Oxfordian's living masters, Shakespeare's Greater Greek by Dr. Earl Showerman. I also encourage them, honestly, because for me, like, we need to be reading more Greek tragedy. Like, we need to be reading like I liked a line in the book where you were talking about how it used to be that because scholars who'd be studying Shakespeare back in the day would have had more of a classical training background, and so they would have intuitively, they wouldn't be like me, having read Shakespeare without ever having read Electra. They would already know in the background and have these intuitive connections. And so I think we as an Oxfordian community, we should all be reading Greek tragedy, and following in your footsteps. Before I let you go, I want to do a rapid fire round of you familiar with the Proust Questionnaire?
No.
Oh, okay. This is so goofy, but this is Marcel Proust was famous. I think like Vanity Fair magazine does this at the end. So at the end, they'll do these like rapid questions where it's like your preferences and your favorite things. So just this is kind of the hot seat. So don't feel the need to think too hard, but
Okay.
there's like 10 little questions here. What is
Oh,
your
this is like the Colbert questionnaire. Okay.
what's your favorite virtue?
Kindness,
What's your favorite quality in a man?
courage,
What's your favorite quality in a woman?
generosity,
What is your chief characteristic that defines you?
the student,
What do you appreciate most in your friends?
their brilliance,
What's your main fault?
being an Obnoxfordian,
um, what is your favorite occupation?
medicine, the career I had in emergency medicine. Yeah.
What's your idea of happiness?
Fulfill dreams, contentment, peace with your family, gratitude, and patience.
What's your idea of misery?
Being alone and bereft.
If not yourself, who would you be?
Oh, I could get very ambitious.
Go for it.
If not myself,
It's funny because Proust said, since the question does arise, I prefer not to answer it. All the same, I should have very much liked to be Pliny the Younger.
Well, that means I get to live a lot. Okay, let me be Socrates,
Okay. Wow. Where would you like to live?
where I live now, in the Oregon woodlands, where for the last 30 years we've created a little homestead. So,
Wow. What's your favorite flower?
Daphne,
What's your favorite prose author?
mm, Nikos Kazantzakis, in translation, of course.
Who's your favorite poet?
Well, since songs are poems, and he did win a Nobel Prize in literature, Bob Dylan.
Cool. Um, who are your favorite heroes in fiction?
Oh, Odysseus. Um, he would be number one. And I think I'll leave it at that. He's he's
One.
he's big. He's big.
Thank you. This has been Dr. Earl Showerman, author of Shakespeare's Greater Greek. Thank you so much for being with me, Earl. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a real blessing to have you in our company and helping in the way that you do and the interest that you show in the things that we share. So thank you again, Phoebe.
Thanks, Earl. Oh, yeah, so it's coming out June 16th, right? That's when the book's
June
coming out?
16th can be ordered on Amazon, both in the US and the UK, and I think in the EU. Amazon allows that kind of capacity, so you don't have to ship it across the ocean. It's print on demand. It self-published. Listen to Folk is my style editor. They did a brilliant job of pulling us all together and creating imagery that goes along with some of the plays. But really, her artistic vision is impeccable,
I
and
loved how it looked. It looked gorgeous.
the last 6 months that we've really been working on this has been a total pleasure. She is so capable. So thank you, Lucinda.
Great. We'll have some Amazon links and stuff in the description. And it's been such a pleasure talking to you today.
Thanks for watching. Shakespeare's Greater Greek by Dr. Earl Showerman is available today on Amazon via the link in the description. Please like and subscribe to my channel for more Oxfordian content, and follow me on TikTok at Phoebe_DeVere.